Hi, we're looking at Jesse Morrell's 20 indictments against Calvinism, and his 7th indictment, which we're looking at now, he's talking against the doctrine of total depravity. And what we mean by the doctrine of total human depravity is that each person, man or woman of all ages, has been integrally, every aspect, every faculty and part of their being has been corrupted under the curse as a consequence to Adam's sin. We are all sinners and have and according to how we'll see Jesse defines it, that is, they have a sinful nature, makes them sin, and are incapable of obeying God. Now, we don't deny that some people may exhibit forms of righteousness and so forth, and exhibit these ascetic feats and all sorts of forms of righteousness apart from the grace of God, person not even be regenerated and so forth. We could see, for example, an atheist trying to feed the poor and working to help the poor and so forth, or whatever it may be. But in God's eyes, according to the Calvinist position, all those forms of righteousness are forms of self-righteousness, and therefore what is not of faith is a sin according to God, and He won't look for them or answer any of their prayers because they have a wedge between them, a wall between them and God, which Jesus Christ, according to His grace, He mediates between the elect and God. But let's look at his argument here. That is, if Calvinism is true, and if the doctrine of total depravity is true, then according to Jesse Morrell, that would mean sinners are not victims, but they are criminals. Now we need to look at his argument to see how he defines what it means to be criminal. And his position is that sinners are criminals if they violate God's law according to their own free will. Thus, if there is no free will, then a person cannot be held morally accountable or culpable if they sin and transgress God's law. And there's certain aspects to that that are presupposed, that is, a person's conscience is not been corrupted under the fall, and a person's free will is still intact in that they were made in the image and likeness of God, that free will gives them this moral volition and this capacity to choose either good and also to equally be inclined to choose evil. But let's look at what his actual argument was in the video. His first premise is that if sinners are not people who violate God's law by their own free will, that's his first proposition, assuming that his position is not true, that sinners are not people who violate God's law by their own free will. And in that, he begs the question, he's assuming or presupposing that in order for you to be guilty against God's charter of law, the Torah, you have to have this sort of free will. He doesn't define what that term is, but I think we know what it's talking about. I've already defined it for him. And his next proposition is part of this first premise, but are born with this sinful nature that makes them sin with a nature that is incapable of obeying God. So basically, if Jesse Morrell's position is incorrect and Calvinism is true, because they both can't be true, they're contrary to one another, and then his conclusion is, then they are just victims of their circumstances, they are not criminals of their own choices, then they are victims of their birth. Now, keep in mind, in this last term, it would be a logical fallacy if his argument was, if not A, but B, then C. But really, the form of his argument is, if not A, but B, then A, which is like a classic logical fallacy. And the reason, the conclusion, is his first proposition, which he said could not be the case if Calvinism was true. Then the conclusion of that would be that his position is affirmed, then that would be, of course, a logical fallacy. Now, why is his conclusion the same as his first proposition, that if sinners are not people who violate God's law by their own free will? The reason this is because of how he defines his term. And the reason it must be a logical fallacy, because his first proposition, that is, sinners, if Jesse Morrell's position is not true, and then his conclusion mirrors the terms defined in his first proposition, which said that it cannot be true. Now, Jesse, in that he's arguing against Calvinism, he is trying to affirm his position, but the whole point of making an argument is, for example, to say, if something is true or not true, and then if this is true, then this would be the conclusion, and that conclusion has to be consistent or not consistent, or logical or not logical, and if it's not logical, then the position's wrong, or if it is logical, then the position is correct. If the premises are correct, then the conclusion, if it logically follows, then the whole argument affirms a position or argues against a position. But if Jesse says that if he denies his own position to make this argument, he's basically trying to make a Calvinist argument and then show that it's false. Basically, the way he's defined what a criminal is a person who violates the terms of God's law by their own free will. So if he first, in his first premise, says that that can't be the case, and then in his conclusion defines what a criminal is by the choices for being victims of their circumstance, that makes them not culpable, then what he's doing is he's affirming the first proposition, which he already negated. He already, for the sake of argument, said that that can't be true. So he's basically saying, if not A, but B, therefore A, which is a classic logical contradiction. So let's look at what victims of their circumstances means in the context of his argument, because the conclusion was, then they are just victims of their circumstances. They are not criminals of their own choices. They are victims of their birth. Now, what does it mean to be, in Calvinism, a victim of the circumstances, and what are the circumstances? Well, the circumstances, according to the second premise, the second proposition of Jesse's argument, is that a person is born of a sinful nature that makes them sin with a nature that is incapable of obeying God. So basically, the term would be that a person who of a sinful nature actually sins and transgresses the commandments that God gave, God's law, and they don't necessarily need free choice in order to be counted and accountable as a sinner. So basically, you can't just say in your conclusion, therefore, they're not culpable because they're culpable. That can't be the case. It does not follow. And the conclusion from the Calvinist position would be that a victim of your circumstance, what is the circumstances? That they are guilty and accountable. So you can't say they're not accountable because they're accountable and culpable. It wouldn't logically follow. So I've seen people praise Jesse's videos for his reasoning skills and so forth. Basically, just because they believe what his position is, pelagianism. But then again, I've seen Jesse Morrell in his videos boast about how God gives us free will, and that God gives us logic, and there's this moral faculty that's innate within everybody that is logic, and it's God-given, and therefore there must be a God or something like that. But the whole thing is, his argument against Calvinism is not logical, at least how he defined it in his video making this case. So let's look, again, we see that he's assuming neutrality, this form of moral neutrality when it comes to these terms. But if his second premise is true, what the Calvinists affirm, and that's what the Calvinists say the Bible teaches, then there is no sort of neutrality which is presupposed, when in his first proposition he actually, for the sake of argument, would have to negate. So basically his conclusion can't come to this sort of presupposition that there's this neutrality here.